good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the diaTribe Foundation's 2021 Lightning Talks, Stigma and the Stories We Tell. Our theme this year is therefore centered on the power of storytelling. As we get started, I'd like to thank our partners in this work. Our presenting sponsor are the amazing people at OneDrop. Our silver sponsor are our long-term supporters at Abbott, and our bronze sponsors are the good folks at AstraZeneca and Dexcom and Sanofi. In 2016, diaTribe launched the D-Series. And the D-Series is a sort of think tank. It's an annual gathering of patients and doctors and other healthcare professionals, researchers, policymakers, food, drug, technology, industry folks, as well as members of our fellow diabetes and obesity nonprofit organizations. So we all come together to discuss ways about how we can work together to improve the lives of people with diabetes. Together, this group identified over 100 different levers that sort of impact everyone who has diabetes and the people who love and care for them. These levers are things like food, medicine, insurance, research, federal healthcare policies, the media, hospitals, poverty, wellness, the list goes on and on. But so there are many of these levers, and we map them all out so that we could understand how we could help the greatest number of people. And we found that stigma played a role in many parts of this map. The stigma was the result of this sort of misplaced idea that diabetes is the result of poor choices that people make about food and exercise, and therefore is the fault of the people with diabetes. So together, we embarked on an effort to better understand how we could eliminate diabetes stigma. And we started by looking at those groups that have successfully attacked stigma, like the people who work in HIV/AIDS or in some of the cancers. And the answer that we learned was pretty simple, that the more you can increase empathy for another human being, the harder it is to judge those people. And a powerful way of increasing empathy in other people is by sharing stories. Your story or somebody else's story. It doesn't have to be your story, but these stories create a connection, a human connection that allows us to see part of ourselves in other people. And it expands our understanding of the world and ourselves and other people. One powerful story that encouraged us to look at new and exciting ways of thinking about stigma and ultimately led us to tonight's program was told by the storyteller, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Her famous TED Talk about the danger of a single story moved many of us to see how storytelling could impact and help us address diabetes stigma. We are fortunate tonight, through the generosity of the host of TED Talks, to be able to share this story with you, her story. Let's watch it together.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukuloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who are not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I'm confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her Southern relatives who had moved to the North, and she introduced them to a book about the Southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
To quote Miss Adichie, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, they are just incomplete. The consequence of the single story is that it robs people of their dignity, and it emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. It's pretty good stuff, isn't it? You can see why we were inspired. I'd like to now turn the program over to my friend and one of diaTribe's biggest supporters, David Lee Strasberg, the creative director and the CEO of the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute. As one of the premier acting coaches in the world, he knows a little about how to tell a good story. David, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. I'm excited to be here and excited to dive into some of our stories today. So our first speaker is someone who I liked from the first moment I met her. She has spent decades as one of cable TV's most successful programming execs at the Food Network. There she is, Eileen Opatut. At the Food Network, she brought shows like The Iron Chef right into the lineup, and she also brought talents like Anthony Bourdain and Rachel Ray, among many others, to the air. She also launched National Geographic Television and Logo, the first ever LGBTQ cable network. But that actually isn't why I liked her. What I really was impressed by right off the bat was I was just struck by her immense generosity and frankly, her commitment to this space, right? To making change for us in the diabetes community. We're lucky to have her here with us tonight. Please welcome Eileen Opatut.
Hello, everyone. My story is about a variety of different forms of stigma that impacted everything that I've done. I started struggling with my weight in college. Sound familiar? And as you might expect, I have felt stigmatized about my weight since that time. Fast forward to my 30s. Pregnant with twins, I contracted gestational diabetes and it didn't go away. I was ashamed. I didn't tell anyone. And I learned that it was untreatable. Society told me that it was about a lack of discipline. It was very uncomfortable to discuss. And above all, very, very sad. I did my own research, but remember, this was almost 27 years ago. And most of what I read was about potential amputation and that I should keep checking my feet. So I was not only terrified, but extremely misinformed. But at least I had an out. It was gestational diabetes, not my fault. And I have used that as an excuse ever since. And it wasn't just the media or societal prejudices. It was also my doctors. When I was first diagnosed, they didn't really tell me in much detail about diabetes long-term effects. I learned about my increased chances of heart attack and stroke, but never why. I'm a well-educated woman, but because I had so little information about diabetes and its slow progression, and was only taking a little bit of metformin at the time, I just simply ignored it all. I didn't realize what it was doing to my nerve endings, my healing time, my GI system, all my organs. And because my doctors didn't take the time to educate me properly, I didn't take it seriously myself. Obituaries say that people die of complications of diabetes, but they never say what those complications are. What does that mean? Don't you ever wonder? And don't you wonder why they don't tell us? And how helpful it would be to inform the general public. One well-regarded Park Avenue doctor took an interesting approach. He made me take these little black pills that would keep my body from absorbing the fat that I consumed. It was that, or he threatened the only other choice would be bariatric surgery. Unfortunately, the pills also made me hallucinate. I was so afraid of the stigma I felt from my doctor that I was afraid to stop taking them. It was really only when I started hallucinating while giving an industry speech that I came to my senses. The pills had started impacting my work and my reputation, and I had to stop. I went to a new endocrinologist and asked him about losing some weight. He was clear. Don't focus on that. In fact, he said, most of the medications you take will prevent you from losing weight. Really? Is that true? I joined Weight Watchers. They didn't have a specific program for diabetes at the time, even though more and more of their clients were suffering from it. I even went to the Pritikin Center. Very little sodium, little protein, no fat. Difficult to follow. But it worked with weight loss and blood sugar levels. But it confused me even more because it was the exact opposite of what nutritionists had been telling me for years to control my diabetes. Now, I was in charge of all the programming on Food Network for about a decade. And I was the media. I was hell-bent on including content about healthy diet and diabetes. It was the perfect platform. This was my chance. I'd successfully launched the TV careers of Ina Garten and Tony Bourdain and Rachel Ray. I was certain I could do this too, but it didn't work. No matter what talent or format I tried, viewers didn't watch. Viewers wanted to watch baking competitions and melted chocolate waterfalls. It's escapism. I call it food porn. But I had failed to introduce content that was very important to me about healthy eating in any way. So you could say I've suffered stigma professionally as well. And the diabetes progressed. My body doesn't produce insulin anymore. I have been on insulin for 8 years. Is it because I didn't treat this with enough seriousness? Maybe, maybe not. But here's what did happen. About 5 years ago, during a casual lunch with my brother, my thin, athletic older brother, he took out some metformin. He was diabetic too. And he had been too embarrassed to tell me. It was a big day. On that day, I could finally say, it's not my fault. I had a genetic disease. And I could get to the business of truly educating myself and taking ownership of my disease, not the shameful outcome of not taking care of myself, of my failure. All the stigma that I had attributed to myself and had haunted me for decades. I'm much better now in every way. But in our society, the stigma of diabetes and obesity runs deep. And that's why I decided to help and share my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. It's both an amazing journey, and it really reminds me that in so many ways, some of the most powerful stories we tell are the ones that we tell ourselves, right? And the sort of insidious power that lies there. Thank you for sharing. Our next lightning speaker, let me just say, Dr. Phyllisa Deroze, it took me about 30 seconds of hearing her speak before I knew that, like, this is a formidable leader in our community. She's a scholar. She's a diabetes patient advocate. She's also a lifestyle blogger about chronic illness. You can see some of her work at DiagnosedNotDefeated.com. DiagnosedNotDefeated.com. After a year of being diagnosed with diabetes, she also founded Black Diabetic Info. And she's been on the cover of Health Monitor. She's been featured in Diabetic Living and Diabetes Focus magazines. Her research includes health narratives in literature, drama, and popular culture. She is absolutely a force to be reckoned with, that there is no doubt. And I'm really glad that she's with us today. Phyllisa.
Thank you very much. So I am excited to share my story tonight. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 2011, and the heavy weight of diabetes stigma landed on me almost immediately. After pulling from what I knew about diabetes, which was not much at all, the one thing I knew was that I better not tell nobody but God. That is a reference from Alice Walker's The Color Purple. I didn't know it then, but the weight of diabetes stigma impacted me almost every single day. And because 10 years ago, I had no idea what diabetes stigma was, I want to take this time to present how diabetes stigma impacted my life in various situations in a way that everybody could understand. So I'll start with S for stigma. Diabetes stigma for me was saying the words, I have diabetes, and just crying, just being so overwhelmed by that sentence and not really understanding all that it meant. It also meant not saying I have diabetes in certain situations because I didn't want to feel or to hear other people's comments. Stigma T. T is like talking at dinner parties, distracting people, because really what I'm doing is waiting 15 or 20 minutes for my insulin to kick in before I could eat. And I find that if I'm talking at a dinner party, people are distracted and they aren't realizing, but ultimately I have to wait, and I just don't want the attention of waiting. Stigma I. It was ignoring my diabetes management, especially the highs and lows when I was around strangers or even friends. Feeling isolated. I felt so isolated. Even now, sometimes I still do. So for me, diabetes stigma it happens in those moments when you are ignoring your blood sugar because you're thinking about what other people may say. G, giving up on thinking about living in a world where I don't have to hear horrible, offensive jokes about people living with diabetes. But then it's also getting right back into the fight to make sure that my daughter, when she grows up, does not have to hear horribly offensive jokes about people living with diabetes. It's also about getting overwhelmed with anxiety when taking a flight and the flight attendant yells, I need a diabetic meal for 42G right here. The diabetes meal, I mean, like, really? Like, just feeling like it's my business and I should have the right to say to other people what I'm dealing with whenever I want to. Missing out on fun times with friends or family when they want to go places, and all I can think about is diabetes meal planning, diabetes management, my diabetes supplies, how am I going to carry them? If it's a fun night where you're wearing a little black dress and a little purse, like, how am I going to fit everything in there? And so sometimes just the weight of that causes me to miss out. And then feeling ashamed, not even really understanding why I feel ashamed, but I just do. And the worst part, the most devastating part of the weight of diabetes stigma is assuming that somehow I did this to myself. And when I was diagnosed in 2011, the weight of diabetes stigma caused me to be silent. I started my blog, Diagnosed Not Defeated, like from my hospital bed. The week I was in the hospital, I became a blogger, but I blogged under an alias. And I blogged under an alias for 6 long years. I didn't want anyone to know that the founder of Black Diabetic Info, which was created out of a void that I felt I needed to fill, was created by me. I didn't want people to know that Diagnosed Not Defeated, one of the leading blogs by an African American, was me. Just the weight of all of those things. And it took 6 years for that to change. And I remember the day that it changed. I had recorded a video because I also have a YouTube channel. And I woke up early and I said, today is the day. I put on a beautiful blue dress. I dressed up. I played, I'm coming. I want the world to know. I'm gonna let it show. I did this whole video. I put my name on my blog. I put my name on my website and I pressed submit. And then I freaked out. I say that because I didn't get over diabetes stigma. I pushed through it. And because I pushed through diabetes stigma and started sharing my stories, the most amazing things started happening. So diabetes stigma had me afraid to tell my story, thinking only of the negative responses that I would get from people. And yes, I do get my fair share of horrible, ignorant comments from people, but they're secondary and they can't amount to the amount of comments that I get from people that say, I'm so glad you shared your story. Listening to your story made me do XYZ better. It made me speak up in my doctor's appointments. It made me tell other people that I have diabetes. You know, like me sharing my story, pushing through diabetes stigma has been not only beneficial to other people, but it's been amazing for me. And the most astonishing thing happened. Because I was telling my story, because I became a global diabetes advocate, I shared my story to a crowd of medical physicians who listened intently. And at the end of that discussion, you wouldn't believe what came out of it. What came out of it was, I don't have type 2 diabetes. I live with latent autoimmune diabetes in adults, also known as LADA, also known as type 1.5. For 8 years, I lived misdiagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I am positive for type 1 antibodies, 2 of them, matter of fact. And some days when I think about the heaviness of living with diabetes stigma, more particularly type 2 diabetes stigma, if I had remained silent, if I hadn't shared my story, if I hid like I had been hiding, I probably would have died early because I was in DKA by the time the accurate diagnosis came. And it would have just been so devastating. So I conclude sharing my story to say, I hope everyone pushes through diabetes stigma, and I pray something beautiful comes out of that. Hopefully not a misdiagnosis story, but I hope it's a beautiful experience for you. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you, Phyllisa. Spectacular. And by the way, you better not tell nobody but God. One of the things that we shouldn't miss in that moment is the very next thing that girl does is she starts to tell her story, right? To God, but she starts to tell her story. So important. Thank you so much. Now I want to talk a little bit as we listen to these stories, right? And so many more. I want us to think a little bit about the context of storytelling. So I'm going to talk to us a bit about the nature of story, the power of our conversations to yield change, right? So my best friends, Melanie and Joel, they're my neighbors. And several years ago, Melanie is just having one of those mornings with her, she has 2 girls with her teenage daughter, and she is on her last nerve. Right. And if you're a parent, you know what that's like. There's shouting, there's cussing, there's like just angst in the house. Melanie decides she retreats, she finds some space, and she goes to take a shower. Of course, that's not safe enough. In the middle of her shower, her daughter's head pops into the shower, and her daughter asked her to borrow who knows what, something she had no business having. Melanie, my friend, says, no. Meanwhile, she's having this whole conversation, this inner angst around, they shouldn't be doing this. I'm a terrible parent. They're terrible kids. What the heck is going on? She gets out of the shower, and as she gets out of the shower, starts getting ready, she crosses her daughter again. And she finds miraculously this kernel of inspiration. And she turns to her daughter and says, thank you. Thank you for taking my no so well, she says. You didn't curse at me, right? You didn't fight. You didn't shout. It shows your incredible strength and tremendous ability to control yourself. Now, of course, her daughter's not going to make it easy. She says, well, I did curse. You just couldn't hear me. That parental moment, Melanie says, well, then thank you for speaking softly enough that I didn't hear it. Now, why does she fight for that moment of positivity? Why does she fight for that instant of connection and affirmation when she could have easily gone through and just said, hey, she's behaving badly, and she could have stayed mad all day? I think she did it because she understands the power of a story. In this case, not the story I'm telling you, but the story she is telling to her daughter, right? What we say, conversations big and conversations small, what we say matters, right? I mean, actually, literally, our minds, right? They are like neurologically wired to create models of the world, and they're doing it every day, right? And the story is like the story that a parent tells a child is particularly powerful, yes, but we are all stewards of each other's stories. And the ones that we repeat become true, both in terms of the conventional wisdom, but also even neurologically, metabolically, they start to feel true and unchallenged. So what we choose to reflect back to others, what stories we decide to share, this yields a powerful force that can actually change the model of the world that people around us are constantly both forming, right, and updating every single day, right? So now we have an opportunity here together, all of us here, we have an opportunity to shape opinion, to change minds, right? To support voices maybe that have long been told to be silent. We've heard a lot of that today. Or to amplify perspectives maybe that just have gotten lost in all the noise of a very loud information age, right? And I wonder what we might be able to achieve, what kind of new understanding we could reach if we all took our stories seriously, preserving them, sharing them, retelling them, curating them. And if we consider all of us to be storytellers, not just those of us who are happy to be sitting at some virtual podium, right? We are all storytellers. We all have a duty and responsibility and an opportunity to tell stories, including retelling the stories that we hear at events like this. We all have the power to shape people's thoughts. Literally, stories are the basic form of human communication, right? We heard in the TED Talk, right, how the stories that she heard affected her, but also about how the stories changed, right? How they changed her vision of herself in the world in just the same way as her story has the power to change our vision of our world, right? And my friend Melanie's story of her daughter, the story of her daughter told to her daughter, right, made a contribution of positivity and acknowledgement of truth in what's really a long battle, right? We're in the long game here, right? This long battle for understanding, for self-esteem, for self-worth, right? So what can we do with all these stories you hear, the stories you hear today, but also, the stories we've heard in previous lightning talks, previous modules? I'm thinking of, stories from Anthony Anderson and Jim Gavin, Joan Gary, among so many others. We can retell them. We can share them. We can amplify these stories. We can embrace these stories. But remember that our neurons here, they are literally programming and reprogramming all day, every day. So it's not just creating an event to share a story. Every opportunity, every communication is an opportunity, right? To create a new understanding of people living with diabetes, to create a new appreciation, a new image that comes to mind when someone even hears the word diabetes. Conversations big and conversations small, they all matter. So if you are all now deputized, if we're all potential story retellers, then let's just go over some ground rules. Obviously, in my business, right, we do a lot of storytelling, both my actors and myself. So let's just talk about some ground rules. Rule number one, and I think this one is actually the most important. If you're going to get one thing out of what I have to offer today, it's this: make sure to listen. And I know that may seem super obvious, right? You're like, oh, of course, someone's telling me a story, I should listen, right? But beyond the notions of active listening, which is also a skill that can be developed. So if any of you have been accused of not listening well, know that you can improve that skill with active listening. This is like a muscle that can get stronger. But just as importantly, resist the urge to identify too quickly. All right? Like it may be a well-meaning reaction, but if you jump too fast to how you understand that, to how you experience something similar, to how you totally get it, right? Not only are you actually letting your neurons off the hook here, right? You're letting them continue to run in their accustomed, habitual manner. In other words, you're not learning anything. Metabolically speaking, you are not actually learning. You're not changing your mind, changing the way you think about the world, right? But you also rob the teller of their story and its unique personal meaning, right? So be patient. Be patient with the teller, but maybe more importantly, be patient with yourself, right? Like listen and give your empathy a chance to work its magic, right? Trust me, it can move the world. Guideline number 2, rule number 2, make sure that you have permission. We heard this again in the TED Talk, the notion of telling someone else's story. We don't want to overwrite somebody else's story. We don't want to hijack it or co-op it. So the storyteller, you want to check yourself, right? Often their consent is tacit, right? Like for example, publishing your story on a TED Talk or in a book or on a blog. But check yourself to ensure that you are aligned with that storyteller's intention, right? That not just their words are represented, their facts are represented, but actually that their spirit is represented, their intention is represented, right? It's quite important to allow that story. The provenance of a story is valuable. We'll talk a little bit about that in rule number 3, right? So empathize, right? Really listen, rule number 1. Permission, number 2. Number 3, acknowledge your source, right? Acknowledge your source. In a world where it's like sharing has been scaled, right? With such ease, like literally we have a big old button that just says share, right? And it takes no effort from you. It has no personal connection. It's simply a button that will then push this message out to a whole bunch of people. I will challenge you and challenge myself to maintain the human connection to that original teller. When you tell the story of this event, can you maintain the connection to the people who told it to you, right? This issue of provenance and the roots of a story, give it power, give it strength, give it truth, and truth rings like a bell. It's a powerful force. So you also can think about literally how you refer to people. Instead of saying, I might say, my friend Melanie, instead of saying, I knew a woman who, or I heard a story about a mom, right? Now, sometimes you don't know the source, or sometimes anonymity is preferred. In that case, place yourself in this role, like put yourself in harm's way here. And you can say something like, I was moved when I read a story about a woman who, right? In this way, the audience still actually has a way to connect into the story through you. You may not know the original person or you want to protect that person. You become the proxy for that teller, right? Based on your personal connection to that story. Lastly, I said the first rule is probably the most important. This one's right up there with it. I might reconsider my priorities. Use all these stories. When you retell the story, use the story with love and understanding, not with fear and not with anger. All right? We are going to have to change people's minds. We're going to have to change their model and understanding of what it means to live with diabetes, right? So love, compassion, thoughtfulness, maybe a little sprinkle of wonder. These are powerful aspirational perspectives, and they can be much more effective in the long term, right, than some of their faster acting counterparts, right, like fear and anger, which tend to provoke reaction and reactivity rather than true transformation, which is what we're after. Because we are not here to argue. We're here to communicate, right? We are here to share, right? And having a whole community of strong, empathic, impassioned storytellers is maybe our greatest asset, right? And you don't just share what you heard. but share how it changed you, how it changed your thinking, how it changed your feeling, how it changed your perspective. This is a powerful force for good, right? And we have the opportunity to use it in pursuit of understanding, connection, and love. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, David. Yes, powerful stories like yours are what powers so much of the work that we do at diaTribe. So thank you very much. Our program tonight now continues with our community manager, Sharice Shockley, who's going to be hosting sessions in the sessions room, a discussion in the sessions room, which is, you can see I think this is your left. You can join the discussion by clicking on the sessions icon. As we continue to explore more about storytelling and stigma, you're also going to get a chance to hear a poem by one of our special guests, Josh Kutzman. Very excited about that. I read it this afternoon. I'm just all abuzz. So you might check that out. Thank you so much to all of our lightning talk speakers tonight. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Eileen Opatut, Phyllisa Deroze, and David Lee Strasberg. Thank you so much for joining us. I thank you to our audience. We urge you to tell your stories as a way to confront and reduce diabetes stigma. None of the work that happens at Diabetes would be possible without the continued and generous support of our sponsors. Tonight, our presenting sponsor is OneDrop, and our silver sponsor is Abbott. Our bronze sponsors are AstraZeneca, Dexcom, and Sanofi. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Tom Matthew, Devanshi, Arvin, Brooking, Chris, and of course, Sharice. Thank you all again, and let's go meet again in the sessions room. So I'll see you later. Good night, everyone.